Hello, everyone. Thanks for attending this evening. If you have any questions for Marie, which we'll be posing to her at the end, please type them in the chat because you're going to be muted for the whole thing. So yeah, send any questions and appreciation in the chat and we can send it to Marie at the end. So today I have the pleasure of introducing you to a very special guest, all the way from the distant shores of Los Angeles, Dr. Maryanne Wolf. And for those of you that don't know, I run a book club for the Royal Society of Biology, and I spent one afternoon wondering at my own genius after coming to the decision that the next book we would be reading would be Dr. Wolf's book, Proust and the Squid, The Science of the Reading Brain. And I thought to myself, a reading club reading about how reading was possible, how poetic, my own lightning in a bottle moment. And little did I know just how incredible and inspirational this lightning would be. It is not often that you think about how reading is possible, what language is, and how your brain computes these seemingly random squiggles into coherent comprehension. So how lucky today that we have the scholar, teacher, and children's learning advocate, Dr. Wolf, Director of the Center of Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice at UCLA, here to talk to us about some of the themes of her latest book, Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in the Digital World, where she will consider the future of the reading brain and our capacity for critical thinking, empathy, and reflection as we become increasingly dependent on digital technologies. So please give your full and undivided attention to Dr. Maryanne Wolf. Maryanne, please take it away.
Thank you, Emilio. What a pleasure to be with you. And I only wish I could see you. I wish I could be with you, but it is nevertheless a pleasure to know that the Royal Society of Biology is interested in these topics that come from cognitive neuroscience. I'm coming to you from Los Angeles, where our weather is beautiful, but we have a mission, a very important mission at my center, and that mission is for all of us to understand that literacy is not just this extraordinary achievement of the species, but also a basic human right. And those of you who potentially have read some of my work know that we're working in various places in Africa and India and Australia to ensure that children have the capacity to learn to read in various ways. So for us, as it is for the UN, it's one of their development goals, we consider literacy a basic human right. But it is much, if you will, more in a certain sense complex than people have realized until most recently, when we can quite literally image the human brain. And what we know is that literacy creates a network of networks. And in the process, it changes the brain, which changes the life trajectory of the individual, economically, intellectually, linguistically, socially, emotionally. Literally, health and economics are a product of whether a person is or is not literate in many societies. So literacy changes the brain, which changes the individual, which changes the society, and which I'd like you to think about today as a potential contributor to changing the very species and how we go forward in the future. And the reason is that reading is a plastic circuit for our brain. And as such, it is being molded and changed by our digital culture, which has both promise and threats to all of us as we spend ever more time on screens. Now, I'd like to situate us in this moment in the time of COVID. Before the last 5 years, I was always talking about the hinge moment in a transition in communication. But it is no longer a hinge moment. We have moved in from a literate culture into a digital culture, and there are ramifications. And what I'll be doing today with you in just a very short amount of time is connecting work in cognitive neuroscience with what goes on in the lives of the next generation, whether it's in classrooms or in our own lives. And some of you, especially in the Royal Society of Biology, might well ask, why neuroscience connecting to education? Well, my Paris colleague, Stanislas Juan, has said this, and it's absolutely what has guided me. Parents and educators must have a better understanding of what reading changes in a child's brain. I'm convinced that increased knowledge of these circuits will greatly simplify the teacher's task. So on the one hand, I'm extremely interested in using knowledge for helping us learn how to teach better and to disseminate literacy in ever broader ways. But at the same time, I want us to realize that it's not just for our children. Understanding the reading circuit has a very important role to play in how we read, we adults. And it begins with the fact that although language and vision were programmed genetically for us, and some of you may well be geneticists, but the reality, reading has no genetic program. It doesn't unfold after 6 months of myelinization in the brain like vision. No, it is an invention which can only change the brain because the brain has these design principles. And the design principles allow us to make new connections among those areas which in fact are genetically programmed. So one of the beautiful design features of the brain is that it can make new circuits for our inventions, like numeracy and literacy. Now, there's a catch. I call it the Achilles heel and the Achilles shield. And that is that by making a new circuit, we have to acknowledge that there is no one circuit. Rather, it's plastic. And this plastic circuit will reflect the emphases of the writing system, how the child or the individual is educated, but it will also reflect the medium. Now, if you look at this, those of you who perchance speak Chinese or Japanese, you will be using various regions that amplify the role of vision in order for us, certainly in Chinese, to be able to have 5,000 characters known early on to become a fluent reader. So there are differences among writing systems, but there are even differences in alphabets. Now, there are more similarities than differences, but there are absolute differences, and by the same token, the child can have these sorts of differences, not just based on the way that the writing system is reflected, but also in the way that the background of the child is either developing these component parts in the early 0 to 5 period or not. And this is really important for us to understand. Every one of you have a role to play in society so that the future generations know that one of the things we want to do and see happen is to have children from 0 to 5 really developing these aspects of language, the phonemes, which are the smallest sounds in your language. And many of our children are bilingual and multilingual, and it's important for them to develop the first language, but it's also important to develop the phonemes of the language they will study in schools. So one of the things that I want to suggest to you in England, and we certainly are trying very hard to have campaigns in the United States and Canada, is that we need our parents to realize that they play a very important role, and that early childhood educators need to know much more about the fact that language is a really beautifully complex set of systems. And one of the easiest ways we develop it is simply to read every day to our children. Every book that a child has read to them is giving them not only information about the sounds of the language, but the meanings of words, how words are used, and also conceptual background knowledge. Now, we have a lot of different studies, and I am sure that you have studies in the UK about the inequities in language development. The reality is that our very privileged homes are giving a great deal of language to our children, whereas our children who come from less privileged homes often hear much less language. In fact, some of the studies show that there are millions of words in terms of how many times you hear words over and over again in our different socioeconomic strata. Now, what that means is that the more you hear a word, the more it's represented. The more you hear sounds, the more it's represented. The more you hear how words convey concepts, the bigger, if you will, a representation of background knowledge. This is an area of inequity, whether it's the UK or it's our country, or countries around the world, where literally the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. This is something we can change, but it's something that we really need to understand impacts the human brain. And here I'll put my more neurophysiological hat on. My colleagues who are pediatric neuroimagers have looked at those children who receive books. It's called Reach Out and Read for those of you who are in any medical area, and I hope that they have branches in Britain. But the reality is they give well visits, they give developmentally appropriate books. Now, what that does is not just teach that book, it teaches the parents that important information is being given every time you read a book. And here you see the imaging results, which show that those children who have been read to regularly have more representation, more activation in language regions, not only receptive, but also expressive. Now, by the time a child is 5, all these parts of language and vision and cognition are coming together. Also, social emotional aspects. Literally, when we are reading to a child, one of the absolute beauties of reading is that we pass over from our egocentric selves into the life and feelings and thought of others. Some of you may know that Machiavelli used to dress in the costume, if you will, of the author he was reading. Why? He wanted some physical manifestation of his respect for that author. Well, we don't need to dress our children in different clothing to appreciate other, but we need to understand that all these processes are being developed in that first 5 years, and then the educational system is learning, it's helping the child learn to put it together so that it's fast enough to be able to think about what is being read. Now I'm moving into your brains, because what is happening is that we build this very basic circuit where vision and language is coming together. But if all goes well, we have enough speed or fluency to be able to connect to ever more elaborate comprehension and contemplative processes. Now, Proust said that the heart of reading is when we leave the wisdom of the author behind to discover our own. Well, that takes about 100 to 200 milliseconds at the end of the process. But before that, there are these, what I call deep reading processes. And I really want you to think about your own reading as we talk about this. Because what we do as human beings, we're analogy makers. In biology as well as cognitive neuroscience, we are constantly putting together what we already know with what is new in the text. That's learning. But when we do that, we provide a platform for inference, deduction, induction. So this analogical thinking is really leading us to be able to have ever more sophisticated processes being used. Now, one of the processes, sets of processes, is what I said earlier about the social emotional aspect. The reality is that when we read deeply, we are taking on the perspective of others, if only for milliseconds. That becomes the basis for empathy and compassion in a society. But what we also do is we take those analogical inferential skills and it's like a frontal lobe dance. We generate hypotheses and evaluate the truth or the falsehood of the information we're getting. This is one of the most sophisticated acts that we do when we read, but we don't necessarily do it if we don't give time to it. Now, when I say time, I'm talking about milliseconds, but critical analysis cannot be taken for granted. When I look at, I can only speak of my own country, but when I look at how people are so divided into silos of beliefs, whether it's political or religious or whatever, as if there aren't other perspectives. But the problem is that when you go into the silo of the familiar information and you don't take on other perspectives, you have what's called confirmatory bias going on. You think, well, this is the familiar, it fits what I believe, and you are arrested in a, if you will, a pre-conceptualization, a pre-evaluation of the truth of whatever you are or are not analyzing. And the digital culture is part of the problem because it allows us to read very quickly, skim, 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 but that short circuits the extra milliseconds that we have to give. Now, I'm going to only spend a few minutes about dyslexia, but I do so because one of the most interesting brains that we have is that of dyslexia. And this is, and in biology as well as cognitive neuroscience, we can talk about the importance of diversity. And if you look at who are these amazing people in art and entrepreneurs over time who have been dyslexic, you will understand how important it is that this almost 10% of the population is never neglected. We have some of the most incredible brains that have ever been fashioned in our species. Leonardo da Vinci is my most interesting example historically. I have worked with the Smithsonian to think about why the constellation of strengths and differences in Da Vinci are in my, if I had a time machine, I could go back and test him. But I am quite sure that what we would find is that some of the unbelievably unpredictable weaknesses he had in word retrieval, weaknesses in Latin. We're not talking about learning Latin from the standpoint of English. We're talking about an inability to learn Latin when your first language is Italian. So there were so many interesting aspects. We won't go into that, but I want you to realize that when we speak about dyslexia in the population, we're really speaking about a great and interesting mix of strengths and weaknesses that have characterized some of our most important entrepreneurs and artists. Now, when we look at dyslexia from a neuroscience viewpoint, we are also looking always at the strengths and the weaknesses, and we want to look at them over time. Literally in infancy, we can see differences in those children who come from families in which dyslexia is prevalent. And what we do is we see that there are real and interesting differences in some of the connective aspects of our brain that are related to dyslexia. Now, dyslexia, I'm just going to say this for you because some of you are citizens in your community, and I will just quickly say that whatever country we're in, dyslexia is often diagnosed way too late, not till 3 or 4. And we now know that we can go in kindergarten and understand some of the great and interesting differences in our children. So here we have 6 profiles, 2 profiles that are, if you will, gifted readers or average readers, but we have 4 different groups of readers who have great challenges and different challenges. And we want to be able to take those challenges, like if you see here, this group is very intensely impaired in across all the different measures we have. We need to go in first grade because that's when we can change. Now, one of the things that I'm sure is as true in England as it is in the United States, we have inequities aplenty. And our children of color often have never received the instruction necessary for them to reach basic level, much less proficient level. So one of the things that we're really interested in is trying to figure out how we can bring our understanding of how the reading brain connects all these parts to intervention. That's not the talk that I'm giving you today. That would be to educators. But I want you to realize that whether we call it neuroscience or neurobiology, we are studying these differences so that we can do a better job of teaching our children. And so I'm really interested in a very different and newer, if you will, newer conceptualization of dyslexia. And I use this psalm, the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. And certainly that is true for so many of our individuals. Now, on the left side, you see this young man. And behind me, you see a painting. It just happens that, of all things, unbeknownst to me, because I didn't know we had dyslexia in our family, my first son was dyslexic, or is dyslexic, and became an extraordinary artist. Maybe he's not Leonardo da Vinci yet, but it's a wonderful aspect of my work that I'm able to learn not only as a researcher and a teacher, but as a mother. Now, go back to that hinge moment where I've said we passed over from print to digital. My MIT colleague, Sherry Turkle, says this, and I love this expression because this is what I want you to think about. We transgress, not because we try to build the new in our digital screens and apps, but because we do not allow ourselves to consider what it disrupts or diminishes. I am not a person who believes in binary when it comes to the mediums. Some mediums are wonderful for some task, others for different ones. It is not a matter of being traditional versus innovative or print versus digital. It is figuring out what different mediums are doing to us and what they, in fact, are emphasizing in this reading circuit. Go back to one of my first slides. The reading circuit reflects the language, the education, and the medium. Now, my colleague at UCLA, Patricia Greenfield, puts it this way. Every medium has its costs and weaknesses. Every medium develops some cognitive skills at the expense of others. The digital world may develop impressive visual intelligence. And of course, in the last years, this has been just a godsend to us to have the capacity to have remote learning and democratization of knowledge. Some of my colleagues in Curious Learning are using digital technology to teach literacy around the world. But there's a cost, and that's where I go back to the Achilles heel. The cost seems to be giving time, allocating time to deep processing, knowledge acquisition, inductive analysis, critical thinking, imagination, reflection. By any token of my imagination, That's what I call deep reading. Now, what's the evidence? In the book that Milieu said, Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in a Digital World, I go into much more detail. My colleague Naomi Barron, How We Read Now, my colleague Philip Davis in Liverpool, we're all interested in what evidence we have. What evidence do we have that we are changing as a result at different ages? And so what we really are seeing is that attention, stimulation, overstimulation is happening for our very young. And when you compare those children who are all the time on an iPad versus with humans, you have early language development differences. These are some of my colleagues. Now, Europe has a wonderful group called the EREAD Network, and the Barcelona group under Salmeron, Anne Mangan in Norway, Adrian Deval, there's a group in Berlin as well, there's a group in Israel, Rakafet Ackerman. I'm saying these names so some of you may know colleagues in these areas, Tommy Katsir, Marit Barzilai in Israel. Basically, all of these EREAD Network scholars are working on differences between print and digital so that we can help the next generation. And the largest study was a meta-analysis by Salmeron and Delgado, and they took 54 studies. The only thing that the studies had to do was to see comprehension when young adults read the same story in print versus digital. And what you see is print is better for comprehension, especially in sequencing and plot details. Now, some of you may, as I did, say, but what about the digital natives? The last part of that meta-analysis, the ones most recent. And this was a surprise. The results are even stronger for print and comprehension among the digital natives. Now, why? Rakafet Ackerman in Israel did some probing studies, and she finds that they perceive themselves to be better on the screen, just as many of you will. But the reality is, when you ask, well, why are you better? They say, because we're faster. And therein lies the cerebral rub. When you are skimming, as we all are doing, that becomes the new mode of our reading. We're browsing, we're keyword spotting. And the eye movement research people are just showing that we usually do an F or a Z. But the reality is, when you do that, things go missing. There's less time on concentration, much more vulnerability to distraction, especially among our young, less sustained attention, which then will have an impact on both memory, consolidation, and also immersion in reading. And I have to ask you to ask yourself, are you the same reader you were? Are you able to truly immerse and become the other, identify with the other, take on the other perspectives? By and large, most of us are being changed by the way we read. And what happens when if you just even think about our last president, when you have policy being made on Twitter, the complexity, this is not a political statement, this is a cognitive statement. The ability to understand complexity in a limited number of characters and words is not conducive to critical analysis and understanding the complexity, or being able to take on the perspective sufficiently to understand what is different from your perspective and the other. All of this also connects to my love of literature and poetry. When we read like that, not only does critical analysis go missing, beauty. Italo Calvino used to speak about the great effort that he placed upon finding the absolute best word for his thoughts. When you skim, you lose beauty. perhaps more important than that, and here's where I ask you to think about this for your society. We become more susceptible to false information, fake news, false hopes, and demagoguery. This is the real threat. I never thought as a cognitive neuroscientist I would be worried about the connection between the reading circuit and democracy, but I have become so. Now, when I give this talk, I always hate to leave you or leave anyone with a discouraging note. And so I want you to know that we are taking this knowledge, our best knowledge about the brain and how it reads in different mediums, and we're trying to make developmental proposals for how we can do things differently. And so I have the concept of a biliterate deep reading brain, in which by and large most of the, if you will, introduction to reading takes place on print for the first 10 years, while simultaneously, in parallel, our children are learning to code and program, which are, these are tasks and parts of our culture which are essential for the future. But I want ultimately to be able to have our children and ourselves able to choose what medium is best for what purpose of reading. Because it would be, and here I go to philosophy and Martha Nussbaum, it would be catastrophic to become a nation of technically competent people who've lost the ability to think critically, to examine themselves, and to respect the humanity and diversity of others. It is therefore urgent to be producing citizens who can see the different and foreign not as a threat, but as an invitation to expand their own minds and capacity for citizenship. And so I will end this talk by saying my hope is that what we are doing is giving you a beautiful sense of how we take knowledge to both preserve our best and expand at the same time. So thank you, Emilio, for being so persevering to get me to do this. It wasn't
No problem.
easy, but I'm grateful to be able to speak to your society.
And I would just like to ask Maryanne, so I know that one of the ways to strengthen comprehension of words is to engage your motor function, right? Like writing the words out and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're, if you're typing or you're engaged on like a touch screen or something, is that, do you feel like that change in how you're engaging with the language, if you're writing it down, do you think that has an impact on your comprehension of language as well?
There have been various programs that are trying to add note-taking to reading, and I understand what they're doing, but it's interesting. I am a proponent of handwriting, and it's because, especially among the young, the very act of motoric writing is helping give new consolidation to what you're reading. So even though one of my hopes is that this knowledge will help the system address or redress its own weaknesses, I will say there's always room, and I think maybe I should even show your viewers every single talk, every single book, every single meeting. I intentionally write this down so that I am consolidating in memory more by adding just a little of the motoric function. Now, the motoric function actually has some other aspects, which are, I'll just say them really quickly. One of the things that some people in neuroscience have shown is that when we read deeply, we're actually utilizing our motoric function, so that I've used the example of, I don't know why it just is impressed upon me so deeply over the years. But when Anna Karenina jumps in front of the train, she has this red bag, and first she can't do it, and then she does it. We literally, our motor cortex jumps with Anna. And that's, I think, a beautiful aspect of how involved our brain is when we are reading at that truly immersive level. Now, that doesn't happen if we're just skimming.
Mm. No, I've definitely noticed a similar experience. You know, I've read a lot of nonfiction books in my life, but since starting the book club and forcing myself to take notes as I read the books to, you know, have information I can fall back on, you know, for later use, I feel like I am absorbing that information so much better than, you know, in previous times, and it makes me want to go back through my collection of nonfiction books just to start taking notes again and try and understand them better.
And you know, one of the things you're reminding me to say, Emilio, is that rereading is a really important aspect, that you can go back and see yourself years before what you thought. And I find that my notes in books that I have read several times over all the years have given me insight into my own processing of information, and also my own, you know, intellectual development, even spiritual development. I'm very interested in looking at the philosophy and theology books that I read as an undergrad. And then I kept these books and I see how I thought at different times. And it's a beautiful, almost chronicle of our inner life. And that's one of the things that I really wish everybody can understand. Reading gives you a sanctuary, an historical one, an autobiographical chronicle of your thoughts.
Yeah, it is wonderful. I have a couple of questions here in the chat, Maryanne. So Charlotte and Matt were wondering what your thoughts are on e-readers, and you know, do you think that the convenience of having so many books on you at any one time, does the e-reader change in any way how you read?
It does, and I always have both. So if there's a book that I just want to, um, on an airplane when I used to fly a lot, when I wanted just a quick novel that was not important to me, that e-reader was perfect. I didn't have to carry it. But if it was something that I really wanted to spend time on, I carried the book, the printed book, in my briefcase. So it really depends on the purpose. So e-readers are terribly convenient. And that question often is accompanied by, what about audio? And what I would say is that the very principle that I started with, that the reading circuit reflects the medium, that's true for audio, it's true for e-reader, and e-readers are better than reading something long on a computer because you're much more distracted on your laptop, and that's a real problem. The level of distraction takes away from the consolidation in memory. So know that. But the e-reader has a function, and I have friends who say they can't read anymore printed books, and it's because they want to read so quickly. Now, what I suggest is that if you want to read a book really quickly, and your purposes are that, like mine on a plane sometimes, that's great, but it's not the same. And the hope that I have about deep reading is that we can train ourselves to read deeply on the screen, that we can train our young. And so I'm not making a blanket statement, e-readers are bad, not at all. They're different. But if your purpose is really deep reading, I would at least ask you to examine yourself and see whether or not you are short-circuiting those critical analysis and empathic and immersive properties of reading. The audio is so interesting because you get a lot of information, and yet it has the same affordance that is problematic on the e-reader. You don't go back. You can, but you don't. And that's really interesting, because what happens is that when you don't go back, you miss details that were problematic for you. When you comprehend, you are giving time to it, and the screen hastens us. Audiobook, you don't go back and replay it. Again, you can, but you don't.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good way to talk about it. Yeah, I definitely notice that when I'm listening to something, without the function to, when I read something, I often read something multiple times if I miss something. So when you're listening to it, you tend not to go back because you don't want to interrupt the flow of the speaker.
Right.
Okay, I've got another question here from Jane, and she's wondering. Oh wait, I've lost the question. Where's it gone? Yeah, could you expand a little bit more on the impact of digital reading on those with dyslexia compared to those who aren't dyslexic?
Oh, that's a good question. There are aspects of digital technology which are just wonderful for dyslexia. Even though I want, just like all children, I want them to be reading books, I want them to be able to practice the automaticity skills of learning words through digital technology. There are various programs or apps, one's called Rally Reader, that increases fluency, and we've actually done some work on this. So you can use technology in different ways in dyslexia to practice. And that's a beautiful aspect that is very needed in dyslexia, and often goes missing because the teacher doesn't have time to ensure that they're practiced. But that's where digital technology can give us games and things that will engage, but that will give practice to the person who needs those skills. Here's just a tiny example. A child, a typical reader, may learn what sounds go with what letters after, let's say, 10 or a word, 10 or 20 exposures. Some children, individuals with dyslexia, need many, many, many more exposures because they're moving their information from one hemisphere to the other in ways that sometimes are causing a delay. I really appreciate what can happen through digital technology to give that kind of practice.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. And I think we'll end with this question from Mike. So he says, I really like that all the reading skills you've described benefit everyone, not just those with dyslexia. Do some of the same skills and tactics apply to numbers and support those with dyscalculia? I think I said that right.
Oh, that's so important. Yes, there's a really long answer, but the reality is some of these same cognitive processes that we are developing in literacy are also very important in developing numeracy. Now, of course, there are many differences, but there are indeed inference, analogy, deduction, induction, all those kinds of processes are being developed. And I would also suggest that developing programming and coding skills develop some of these cognitive skills that can also benefit literacy and vice versa. So again, we're not talking about binaries. We're talking about what helps all of us become better learners in the future.